do dogs spin before they lay down? And why do dogs' hairs stand up on the back of their neck when they're alerted? And why, when a dog is excited to see you, do they lower their head, pull their ears back, and maybe they get on their back and show their belly? All of these things and more are explained by the great Charles Darwin. And today we are going over his explanation of dog body language. So if you're interested in a nerdy approach to dog behavior, keep watching. What's up guys, it's Jenna with Dog Liaison, where I coach you on how to treat your dog's mental health, and on this channel we break down scientific research in order to inform and educate us on how to train dogs. While dog behavior has been studied a lot by researchers, particularly over the last 35 years or so, there still remains a lot of theories. And even though we have the evidence, a lot of it is based off hypotheses. In fact, I did a 4-part video on dog behavior, which covers the science of dog body language and stress signals. So after this video, if you're interested in learning more, make sure to check that out. But a lot of it is unfortunately still based in theory. And a lot of those theories, at least in some degree, are founded in Charles Darwin's principles and ideas. Most people don't realize that Charles Darwin had a great affinity for dogs. In fact, in his book, Expressions of Emotions in Man and Animals, he references a lot of dogs, and he especially references his personal experiences with dogs. And so today I really wanted to talk about what he describes as dog body language and what he explains away. Now, it's true that some of Charles Darwin's ideas don't necessarily hold up today. Some have been expanded upon, some are just outright wrong. Nevertheless, Charles Darwin's theories have been proven by the scientific method many times, and I think that it's important that we lean in more towards his ideas, more towards his principles, instead of leaning in towards some of these other narratives that aren't grounded in science whatsoever. In expression, Darwin has 3 main principles, and effectively the argument is that most body language, most dog behavior or animal behavior can be explained by one of 3 main principles. Now, these 3 main principles are the principle of habit or association, the principle of antithesis, the principle of the nervous system working independently of the animal's will. We're going to look at all 3 of those principles, starting with number 1, principle of habit. The first principle, the principle of habit, can be explained as a reflexive movement that started off with intent, that started off serving a bigger purpose, but perhaps now is out of context and maybe it doesn't serve that purpose anymore. So an example of this would be your dog spinning to lay down. In the wild, a wolf or a jackal or a fox might spin to carve out some grass, maybe give himself a bed effectively. And in domestication, this isn't necessary, obviously. In domestication, we give them carpet, we give them shelter, we give them beds often. And so this isn't necessarily a required part to live. However, the sequence of spinning to lay down is so hardwired in their brain that they still habitually do it now before they go to sleep. Or, for example, a lifted paw. So you might see a dog that's standing, he might be lifting up his front paw. Today, a lot of times trainers will theorize that this is a stress signal of some sort, that it's indicative of the dog being under too much pressure. Darwin has a more simple answer to that. He says that it's actually just that the dog is getting ready to flee. Now, he might be getting ready to run because he's trying to catch food, or he might be getting ready to run to get away from you, or he might be trying to run to get at you. But the idea is that he's lifting up his paw to step forward, or in preparation to step forward and start charging. Or for example, when you rub your dog's belly and his little legs start shaking, that is also a reflexive movement, and it is a behavior done by habit. When a dog is scratching himself, his leg is going to move that quick. So the explanation by Darwin is that the motor patterns in his body that he would use to scratch his own ears are being engaged when you're scratching his belly, and so his leg is habitually shaking as well. Of course, that doesn't serve a purpose. Him shaking his leg up into the air while you scratch his belly obviously isn't serving any purpose. It's not benefiting anything, but it's not necessarily a logical or reasonable response. It's a hardwired habitual response. Additionally, Darwin also proposes that when a dog is fearful, he's tucking his tails, tucking his ears back straight, because he's trying to limit the amount of space that he's taking up. He theorizes that if the tail is out or the ears are out in the middle of a dog fight, those parts of the body are easily wounded. Those parts of the bodies are easily grabbed and injured. So if the dog tucks his tails or pulls back his ears, they're not as exposed and they're not as vulnerable to being wounded by the enemy. The second principle is the principle of antithesis. But before we get into that, if you're enjoying this nerdy approach, make sure to hit like. Now, the second principle of antithesis, is the idea that if a dog is experiencing an emotion, say joy or happiness, his body is going to demonstrate the opposite behaviors that would be demonstrated when a dog is frustrated or angry, because frustration and anger are the opposite of joy. So this is a little bit confusing. Let's break this down. So in expressions, Darwin uses this example. You're at the park and you are approaching your dog from a distance. And while you're approaching your dog doesn't necessarily recognize you. Maybe he becomes alarmed, he's fearful. So he freezes, maybe he's barking at you, he's really tense, he doesn't recognize you, and he's alarmed. But then as you start to approach closer, he becomes more familiar with you, and he all of a sudden, like a 180 switches his body around, his head lowers, his tail starts wagging, he starts moving his hips. He is all of a sudden very happy to see you. That switch from alarmed, tense to loose and silly, that's the principle of antithesis. That opposite emotions are going to be demonstrated by opposite behavior. The claim is that your dog is, contorting his chest low, lowering his head, wagging his tail, moving his hips, that there's fluidity throughout his body, because that is the opposite of the tension and the stiffness and the closed mouth, for example, that you would see when your dog is alarmed. And so because they're opposite emotions, you're going to get opposite behaviors. Now, I love the principle of antithesis. It's actually my favorite principle of the three, but it is a little flawed. Of the three, it's a little bit more arguable. And that is because it has some issues in the logic. For example, Darwin argues that one of the reasons there's this switch is that there has to be some sort of opposite set of muscular systems. Like there's a certain set of muscles for when the animal is aggressive or angry or predatory, and then there's a second set of muscles for when the dog is happy or silly or affectionate. And obviously that's not true. I mean, we don't use our short head of the bicep for when we're happy and our long head bicep for when we're angry and hitting something. It just doesn't work that way. The muscles work independent of emotions. And going along Darwin's thought, he says that because the muscular systems are opposite, that there's no way that the dogs or the animals could be doing antithesis voluntarily, that they're not doing it logically or intentionally. And personally, I kind of sort of disagree. I don't think that they do it directly or intentionally now. I think that it has evolved to become involuntary. But I do think that at one point, dogs started to see that there was a pattern. That, for example, when I lower my head, which is the opposite of raising my head, humans or other animals view that as docile and they reward that in kind. I think that they started demonstrating some of these behaviors and then were reinforced by the environment or reinforced by the humans. And so they started to take on those behaviors. But of course, those behaviors are now innate. They're now passed on through DNA. And it's very reasonable to assume that they happen involuntarily and not deliberately by the dog. The third principle is the principle of the nervous system, and this argues that the nervous system causes behaviors to happen independently of the dog's consciousness. And so what this basically means is like sneezing, coughing, shaking, hiccuping. These are all behaviors that the nervous system causes that are not necessarily done consciously or deliberately by the individual. Another example of this, which is my favorite, would be how the hackles raise on the back of their neck. This is called piloerection. Now, in expressions, Darwin argues that this is probably only happening because the dog is fearful and that this is a behavior that is exclusive for fear. That's arguable, and I would wholeheartedly disagree. I think that it happens when the dog is aroused, and more specifically when there's a lot of blood being sent throughout the body so that the body is flexed. Specifically what piloerection is, and we explained it in this video, specifically what that is when blood is flexing the muscles underneath the hair and the hair is causing to go up. So it doesn't necessarily have to happen when the dog is fearful. It could happen just because the dog is aroused and needs an extra amount of blood. One of the really interesting things about the nervous system principle is that it cannot be done deliberately. So in fact, when it is done deliberately, usually the behavior is flawed. So for example, I had a client who was teaching her dog to sneeze on cue, and we were able to actually capture the dog enough that the dog did figure out that she was getting chicken every time she sneezed. She figured that out. But when she would try to sneeze on purpose, it came out more as a vocalization. It came out more from her throat, from her mouth, than it did from her nose. She couldn't actually make her nose make the sound. And so that's a perfect example of the nervous system not necessarily letting the behaviors come out intentionally. And so those are Charlie D's 3 principles of emotions. Your job now is to watch your own dog, observe your own dog, and categorize some of his behaviors into one of those 3 principles. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit like. If you want more information on stress signals and dog behavior, make sure to check out these videos. If you have any questions for me, make sure to ask in the comments below, and I'll see you guys soon.